now. Recording in progress. So welcome everybody to this talk that I've titled "So You Want to Make an Album," with CLC board member, past general manager, and current professor at the Royal Conservatory of Scotland, Bekah Sims. So this is going to be super exciting. I've got some questions from you already, so I'm going to hold those until the end. I would ask that if you do have a question, just to pop it in the chat rather than raise your hand or turn your mic on. If it seems like it's a good question to pop in and ask Bekah right in the moment, we'll do that, or I'll do that. But if not, we'll just go back at the end and make sure that whoever's questions has been put in the chat, we'll get around to answering those, and we will open it up to the floor as well for a Q&A. So second here. I'd like to start just by acknowledging that the head office of the Canadian League of Composers is located in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis folks. It is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands, and we are grateful for being allowed to work in their territory. I myself am also in the same place as the CLC head office, even though I work from home. So I'd encourage everyone just to think about the Indigenous lands you're on. Bekah Sims does not need much of an introduction, I think, at this point, but for the sake of posterity, we'll do it. Bekah is, I think, safe to say, over the past 5 years, probably one of the rising stars of Canadian music. Originally from St. John, she did all of her studies, you did 1 degree at Memorial and then 2 degrees at U of T, studying with composers such as Andrew Stalin and Gary Kalesha. She got her doctorate, I think 2018, if I'm remembering correctly. We were colleagues there. She's been at the Gaudiamas Festival. She has been Music on Main, New Music Dublin. She's been invited to have pieces performed at multiple World New Music Days, including the upcoming 2024 World New Music Days in the Faroe Islands. She was on CBC's list of annual Hot Classical Musicians Under 30. She's won the Barlow Prize. She got a Juno in 2023. She had 2 previous Juno nominations before that. And she was most recently awarded a 2024 Guggenheim Fellowship, which is incredible for a Canadian composer. It's not a very common occurrence. So, and she's recorded at this point 3 albums, all of which have been nominated in some way, shape, or form for a Juno. And so she was the perfect person to talk about this. So without further ado, I'm going to turn my screen off. I'm going to shut up, and I'm going to turn it over to the one and only Bekah Sims.
Thank you so much, August. It's also lovely to see everybody's name here in the chat. I recognize a lot of you folks from far and wide. So lovely to see your names, if not your faces. Maybe we'll do that a little bit later. I'm going to pop over to my screen share here. I've made a little PowerPoint about how to make an album from my very specific concert music key perspective, which I'm sure a lot of you folks are coming to it from as well. I will say that one of the most important things about making an album is you should probably be a person who appreciates and listens to albums first. I know that that's not necessarily the #1 mode of how people listen to music nowadays. I think a lot of listening is done through singles rather than albums, rather than collections of songs, collections of pieces. So for me, album listening was really how I engaged with music as a young person and continue to do so. The moment that I had enough space in my home, a record player was the first thing that I bought. So that's important context, is before doing anything artistic, make sure that you love that artistic discipline, even if it's album making and album listening. So why would us as composers, us as musicians, want to release an album in the first place? Well, an album is an opportunity to release a coherent and substantial artistic statement, whether it's a single album length work. I find a very common format that these days for composers, having like about 40, 60-minute work that is released as an album, or a collection of related or complementary works. A lot of us, we write for primarily for live settings, this concert music concept. But when we do that, the audience will always be limited to whoever's able to be in that exact room at that exact time. An album release really allows listeners around the globe and across platforms to engage with your work. Um, and certainly in a way that just releasing something onto YouTube or releasing onto something onto SoundCloud doesn't necessarily have that same reach, I have found. So recording sessions for albums also allow us to sort of capture the works in what I consider that ideal setting. So no audience noise, no room or ambient noise. You can do multiple takes on things. I know there are some composers who even kind of delight in that audience noise, the wrinkling of a candy opening or somebody coughing. It's like part of the experience. For me, I do want that sort of utopic, absolute silent ambience for my pieces. That's how I really kind of think of them. So the studio really helps with that. And we can also use the studio as an instrument. So we can do that sort of close mic approach that we see in a lot of popular music, which allows us to hyper control volume and balance. So in a way, if we have sort of miscomposed the balance ourselves, the studio can kind of allow us to correct it in a way where a part that may have never been audible in real life at a concert can suddenly be exactly as you intended, but you know that it is because of the studio, not because of the way that you've written it. And that's okay too, because that happens all the time with studio recordings. We have music that's impossible to replicate live, but that's okay because it's the studio version. We're allowed to do that as composers as well. And we can also create that sort of imaginary but perfect acoustic space using a studio. Albums also are a great way to solidify relationships with meaningful collaborators, from performers to audio engineers to studios to record labels. It kind of cements your artistic connection with these people. I feel like everybody that I've worked with in recording an album, I've like continued to work with them in some way. It really sort of cemented and made permanent our collaborative relationship. So in addition to the album itself, you'll also have those raw audio files, that documentation of the recorded works for your own personal use outside of the album. So for submitting for applications and grants, once I had studio recordings of my chamber music, my um, acceptance percentage for composer schemes and different applications shot like so tangibly up. I think it increased like 20 or 30%. So even though when we are jury members and we're on panels, we try our very, very best not to think about recording quality and just think about the pieces in front of us. I think that having these really pristine audio recordings absolutely helps us in any of these types of environments where people are listening to a lot of music and things kind of need to stand out in some way. Sometimes the fidelity of the recording, the quality of the recording itself can give us a very tangible benefit, even though it doesn't feel right or fair, seems to be true. I also realize that I am not actually in slideshow mode, so why don't I do this? um, Choosing what to include on an album is one of the most important things. So when you think of an album, it's a type of format that means something. It's not just it's not just a playlist. So an album should be cohesive and coherent. It's not the same as a SoundCloud stream. The works should be curated and thoughtful, the same way that you would program a good concert. You know that some works, if you put them at the top of the show or the end of the show, they can actually fall a little bit flatter than if they were somewhere in the middle. Recent works, not always a particularly compelling theme. Maybe the album is an exploration of how you write for string quartet. So for a single ensemble can be really helpful. And oftentimes that means you can hire a single ensemble and not a bunch of different ones. Or maybe your album is about how you use modular synthesizers with different groups. Or maybe the works have a similar nocturnal or wistful character. And maybe the album is about exploring different genre influences, and those genres themselves can be different from one another, but it's how you integrate different genres within your concert music can be kind of a very vague but helpful theme for the album. And the recorded sound and approach need to be cohesive as well. If at all possible, albums should be recorded in the same location with the same technical staff rather than a sort of mix of well-mixed live recordings and studio recordings. You kind of wanted to have a consistent sound. I mean, like most pop and rock music that you hear will be all recorded in the same studio, usually in the same week or the same couple of weeks by the same people. And I think that it would be helpful for composers to really think of their music kind of in that same way. A clear shift in audio recording quality or location from track to track, it kind of results in that collection of works losing the album quality. It does sound not like an album anymore. It doesn't sound like you went in with that intention of having this be a collection of works that are all recorded at the same time. You really do have to consider the length and the track order as well when you're thinking of the album. There's, I think, a tendency and a desire, especially with the first album, I'm very guilty of this myself, to supersize the album. If you have, especially when you have the funds, you get some support for it. You're just like, okay, well, anything that I want to have been recorded, I should do it now, or maybe it'll never happen again. But sometimes a tighter program is way more effective, and the pacing doesn't drag. And because you want people to listen to it as a collection, as an album, the pacing is very important. And it's maybe nice to consider or remember the shape, the pacing of some of your favorite popular music albums. Like, the tracks are usually of varying duration. They go back and forth between more energetic and more subdued. I often tell my students like they're either writing a banger or a ballad. Um, Really cohesive albums may even have like transitions from track to track with some popular musics. I have experimented a little bit with doing that with some of my pieces, and I have not been quite so bold enough to enact it yet, but short interludes or ambient tracks in between larger pieces, when I've heard it in other albums, I've thought has been very effective and very much gives it that like kind of popular music album feel. So I'm going to briefly go through my 3 releases and just talk a little bit about them before going into kind of the step by step. My first release was in 2018, Impurity Chains. So I'm just going to, well, maybe I won't read it out. You can see it there. That's the what do they call it? Sort of like the press info for people who wanted to know a little bit about the album. It's an album for small forces that kind of what binds all of the works together is a sense of referentiality, whether it's using quotation or referencing other genres. This album is super, super eclectic. The pros are that it's holistic. It's a very thorough release of my works that were using this approach up until this point. But the cons of that is that I do believe the duration is slightly long, sometimes an overly similar track feel. A lot of things are kind of slow and unfolding. And the instrumentation and ensembles are very, very different from one another. So you've got like a vocal quartet with electronics, an electric dectet, a guitar solo with vocoder. Like, it's just sonically like really, really quite all over the place. And I think that's okay. But if I were to have recorded this album now, I would have taken a little bit more of I would have, I think, cut the fat a little bit more on it. My second release was Ghost Songs, which is an EP from 2022. Ghost Songs, what it has in common between the 4 tracks is that they're all works for soloist and electronics. And the electronics are always made up of recordings of the soloists. So of the 4 kind of on the shorter end pieces, 3 of them are part of this Skinscape series that I do, and which is just for solo instruments and recordings of themselves. And then the final track is Jubilant Phantoms, which is not quite a part of that series of pieces, mostly because the way that the electronics works in the Skinscape pieces is usually like quite granular and like anxious, and they all have a very, very dark character. And the Jubilant Phantoms is like somehow a kind of, for me anyway, kind of a happier piece, although it is still kind of dark sounding. So the pros with the EP, and I do like an EP format as well. It was succinct, cohesive collection of works. I think they work really well together. The material itself was like similarly composed or treated, but like had a variety of moods and affects. Like I mentioned, kind of a con maybe is that there was that sort of non sequitur tapped in at the end, but in a way it kind of worked as a coda. Like, you had these 3 pieces that were part of a set and then a coda, and it so happened that piece also had a music video associated with it. So it's like you kind of listen to this set of pieces and then you watch this video as almost like a dessert. I kind of thought of it as like a tasting menu, and I thought that worked fairly well. And my most recent release, somehow in the same year as the EP, Bestiaries, is an album for chamber orchestra, with and without electronics. So this one, a much bigger project, smaller amount of tracks, but much more involved in the creative process. It was quite an undertaking. So for this one, the pros, that similar ensemble type and compositional approach had super varied results. So even though I was using kind of like all big sounds, the pieces are still like quite different from one another. I really enjoyed the track order. And even though we pressed it on vinyl, we were still able to maintain the track order, which I was a little bit nervous about because you've got like the flipping of the disc is something to consider. The works were also composed very closely together chronologically, which helped them be a bit more coherent in identity. I'm sure the longer that you're writing, like you've got like this span of decades of pieces that you can include, which can be quite challenging if your interests have changed a lot, and that can create a really nicely contrasting album. But for me, I was just like, I had a lesson with the composer George Lewis, and he described it as schizophonic, and it's just like all kind of super varied maximal stuff. And I think that they somehow, even in all of that variety, they kind of work back and forth. So the album is quite a bit shorter in length, but each piece is like dense listening, is heavy listening. So, and they were also chosen because they were sort of a mature representation of the work. In some ways, I consider some of the pieces on Impurity Chains to still be almost kind of student compositions in nature. So once you've thought about all that, why you want to release the album, what you want to include on the album, what kind of order of the pieces you want on the album, got it all planned. What is the next step? So first is finding a label or a distributor or a distribution method, one of those things. Um, you should probably do that before embarking on any fundraising or grant writing or any other administrative tasks, of which there are many. You do need to know who's distributing your music because your funders are going to want to know that. It's very important to know kind of what the home is for your music once it's out there. Um, Almost all classical and experimental music labels, especially in Canada, are non-commercial. So you don't really get an album deal. You don't really get like paid to release these albums. You will receive a portion of sales from your album, but likely you will actually have to pay the label for the physical manufacturing or the distribution and or the administration of the album. So people coming from other genres often find this very shocking or surprising, but it is super normal. Like you're not being taken advantage of to pay for this stuff. It is kind of like the industry norm. But because the music and the labels are non-commercial, it means that you're eligible for Arts Council funding for these recording projects, and they don't really happen without substantial governmental funding. So some labels for contemporary classical music in Canada include Redshift, Center Discs. I think they're currently on pause, but with imminent plans to sort of restart distribution. The only thing about Center Discs is that you do have to be a CMC associate composer to release on that. Leaf Music, Analecta, People Places Records. These are all options in Canada. You're not limited, of course, to a Canadian label. Other options include releasing independently, very important to go through Bandcamp for that. And there are some American options like Parma, which offer kind of expensive packages, but with Parma, and there's another one called Convivium in the UK. Basically, when you pay them for their services, they can also provide you ensembles. They can provide you an entire orchestra. They can provide you a professional string quartet. So they take a very large share of the administrative work as well, which is why they're expensive. Um, a lot of the Canadian ones are a little bit more hands off in terms of you kind of need to decide and provide a lot of those things yourself, which you might prefer to do. It's not necessarily a con. Um, so most of the time you'll need to reach out to a label yourself. You're not going to hear from them in your inbox unless they are like Parma, who are they're a for-profit organization. And I think a lot of composers have probably maybe heard from them at some point or another. So when you reach out to the label, you've got to have a compelling pitch for your album, which is why you should have kind of come up with your track order, the vibe of the album already before you start reaching out to these folks. Who the performers are going to be, the approximate timeline for its release, yeah, and just a general concept and atmosphere for the album. So like all those things you need to have sorted before you start reaching out to people. If you have a title and a short description, kind of like a little paragraph that they would use for PR, it's challenging because your album doesn't exist yet, but you kind of got to have that little package ready to go. Um, as I mentioned, like different labels will offer differing amounts of support. So Redshift, I find very affordable, but they will require you to provide like, the graphic design, the completed master tracks, etc. Center has sort of a package that's a few $1,000s, so it's more expensive, but they do provide you the graphic design, the cover art, the translation, because it's Centre Disc. Everything has to be in French and English, but they will do that translation for you. It's just that it's part of the fee that you're paying them for. And they'll also submit on your behalf to different awards. So if you're eligible for an East Coast Music Award, they'll send in your album for that. Same with the Junos, same with the Western Classical Music Awards. So that can be very handy. So I mentioned Bandcamp earlier. They have a surprisingly robust ecosystem for contemporary classical and experimental music. There's a lot of releases on there, including from big international labels that have their Bandcamp, or rather that have their releases set up through Bandcamp in order to purchase through them, including physical releases. There are monthly and annual roundups and reviews of releases specifically for contemporary classical music and for experimental and for jazz. Like basically, if you release like a really solid contemporary classical music album through Bandcamp, there's like a good chance that you'll be included in one of these. And the writing is excellent. Like their staff writers are super thoughtful. You can get all sorts of like really lovely press quotes from them. It's good, skilled writing. So no matter who your label is, just ensure that they're also putting their releases through Bandcamp, because you can, of course, you can do that independently, but you can also do it through the label. So Center Discs actually just recently, I think, started releasing stuff through Bandcamp, and Redshift has been doing so for a while. And I think Bandcamp actually did like a feature article on Redshift as a label after they had released quite a number of things through Bandcamp. So you've got a label. Now what? So finding and applying for that album funding, super, super critical. As I mentioned before, this is non-commercial music. So you've got access to municipal, provincial, and federal public grants, as well as private grants. So I know that not everybody lives somewhere where there's robust council funding for recording. So if you're in Toronto, you do have those 3 levels of recording grants available to you. You can apply from the Toronto Arts Council, Ontario, and Canada Council. But if you don't have those municipal and provincial options, the Canada Council has a very high budget limit for concept to realization grants, which albums fall under. I think it's at least like $50,000. So even if you don't have access to those other grants, you could get all of your funding just through the Canada Council. And if you're working here in Canada and you have an approved profile, then you might just be able to apply to the one place. Although I will recommend, in addition to Canada Council, everybody who's doing an album should also be applying to Factor, which is the foundation assisting Canadian talent on recordings. They provide up to $10,000 even for first-time album creators. They're funded by the government, but they're kind of private funding. The thing about writing grants is that assessors like to see that you have multiple streams of income. So if you can get that 10K guaranteed from Factor and then apply for your Canada Council grant with that 10K already in your budget, that already looks more viable for the assessors looking at your application. So one of the most important things that you can do, both for your funding application, but also for your own sense of organization and scale and knowing what you're getting yourself into in a way, is crafting a reasonable and industry standard budget. You really have to pay everybody what they are ethically owed. It's super, super important. There's also a tons of fees that you might not have considered. And the arts councils and the prospective musicians that you might be hiring, they really expect you to pay fair and reasonable rates. So one of the things that you get assessed on with the Canada Council, and I think with other granting juries as well, is this idea of viability. And so if you are paying people non-standardized, non-union rates, they consider that to be unviable because you're not contributing healthily to like the ethical economy of what we're doing. So it's integral that you find the union rates for both rehearsing and recording the music, as well as the recording sessions themselves. They have different rates. There are a number of union norms that you also may not have considered if you're not a performer yourself. For me, my sort of performing days ended in my undergraduate over 10 years ago. So I wouldn't have thought or considered that there are extra fees for doubling, for example. So you might need to pay somebody a little bit more if they're playing clarinet and bass clarinet. You'll have extra fees for leaders, which are the concertmaster of your orchestra or your conductor. If you have a soloist, that's sometimes double the fee of everybody else. There's also extra cartage fees for harpists or percussionists, anybody that might need to drive a vehicle to attend your rehearsal, basically. Many of your musicians may also charge HST or taxes, which you have to budget for as well. That stumbled me for sure, because if that rate is about 15% and you haven't budgeted for it, then you are 15% short potentially on your performer fees. One of the ways that you can kind of straighten that out is making sure that when you do hire ensembles or you hire musicians, you have contracts with the amount in them. If they're not charging HST and they sign that, well, then they're happy with that rate. If someone comes back to you and say, actually, you're going to have to change that to reflect the fact that I charge HST, you will learn that through the contract process. So getting people to say, yes, of course, I'll come record your album for that much is great, but having everything in writing and having everything in contracts is also super, super important. So in addition to rehearsals and recordings fees, you also need to have fees for your audio engineering and recording, mixing and editing, which is different, separate fee from your engineering and recording. Mastering, which I have learned through the process of doing these albums, is usually a different person than the person who does the mixing and editing. I always thought they were the same person. They're not. Physical manufacturing, you have to consider what you want and what you can pay for with CDs versus vinyl versus cassette versus digital only. And there are pros and cons to all of that stuff too, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Album art, graphic design, which is often different than the album art. So if you're looking for so for example, with a CD, you've got your cover art, you've got the disc art, you've got like the art in the case itself. That person who's doing that art is probably not the person who's doing your typesetting in your booklet. Again, that was not a meaningful distinction that I knew of before I started doing albums. You will need to pay for a copywriter or a publicist. You can do some of that yourself, some of your own copywriting. I know how uncomfortable so many of us are with talking about our music in glowing, positive ways. So hiring someone to do it for us can be very, very handy. And the way that, like with publicists as well, they kind of know, it's its own part of the trade that none of us are super well versed in. So hiring an expert for that is very helpful. You might want to hire a photographer or a stylist for artist photos if you want your photo within the album somewhere. Sometimes people have themselves on the cover of their albums, a little bit less common for composers, but it does happen. If that's the case, you want to make sure that you have like a really professional photograph for that. A producer, I'll talk a little bit about what a producer does in a classical album shortly. An album administrator or an orchestra manager. This is, as you can tell from what I am saying, there is a lot of administration to all of these processes. You can, within your budget, hire someone to do this for you or compensate yourself for doing it. That's very, very important. Rental fees for the rehearsal space and the studio space itself, cartage and moving fees for instruments, and instrument rental. That's mostly relevant for percussion, unless you hire a percussionist that just happens to own every single percussion instrument that you've written for on a piece, which is kind of unlikely, I think. So you also have to research your technical personnel, because I say, oh, you have to hire the engineer, and you might be thinking, how do I find an engineer? Recording and mixing, of course, is its own art entirely. You should work with someone who will make your music sound great, better than you can even imagine it sounding. The person that I work with all the time is Paul Talbot. He does that to a T. In fact, I believe his email is soundsgreat something at gmail.com, and he's right. So do you want someone with a classical music approach or more of a popular music approach, somewhere in the middle? I think it's important to listen to Canadian albums and find someone who has a sound as an engineer, as a recordist, that would work well with your music. So for me, I really like almost like a popular music, rock music affect with my classical music. I like it to be reverb heavy. I like it to be super close mic'd and feel like you're like right next to the cello. Lots of people would much rather have their string quartet recorded at a bit of a distance in a church, not at a studio. They want to kind of create the feeling of a concert. And for me, I love the sound of a studio. So knowing what you actually like and what you want, and which engineers do like or specialize in one of those rather than the other. Lots of engineers are super flexible and have done both, but maybe have a slight preference or have just a special touch with one of those approaches that you would more want to hire. And likewise, the studio that you choose to record in will have different types of equipment and different types of things available to you. So do you want it all to be digital or all analog? The microphones that are available in the studio change. Like, you can get hyper specific with some of this stuff, but you kind of just need to have a vision for the overall approach. And there's, I think for a lot of us that requires just some research and some listening, which is going to take time before you even start your rehearsals and your like you're in the trenches. It's quite different. So maybe you're having trouble with the vision because, as I said, it requires a ton of knowledge that a lot of us don't have offhand. So you have to decide whether it would be useful for you to work with a producer for your albums. So a producer will be present during the rehearsals, the recording sessions, and they'll provide feedback to the ensemble and to the engineer in order to really sculpt the session and bring it in the direction that you've sort of given them. Like, you can sort of give them broad adjectives and they'll make the specific tangible decisions that you need in order to meet those adjectives. They'll take note of the best takes and they'll listen back to the takes after the recording session to stitch together the best overall version. So a producer is often quite expensive. It represents a lot of the time like a substantial proportion of your budget. That person who's producing should be confident, decisive, super knowledgeable about what you want. Because it's one thing for them to have a vision, but that needs to line up with what your vision is too. So they need to know, or at least very much understand, the musical and intended affect of the album and of your music. So for this reason, the composers are often producers for their own albums. But when you do this, you have to ensure to pay yourself a nice big producer fee as well, because it is a tough gig. You're making a lot of decisions. A lot of the stakes are kind of on your shoulders. So, that's a very important budget line. So I mentioned publicity, such an important aspect of releasing an album. Like, thousands of hours of sonic media are released online every single day. I forget the exact statistic, but like, if it would take like a dozen years to watch the YouTube content that is uploaded within a single 24-hour period. Like, there's just too much stuff for people to pay attention to realistically. So how can you ensure that interested people will hear your album? So even when releasing an album through one of the labels that I mentioned earlier, I highly recommend hiring an independent publicist because it is such specific work. A lot of these publishers they're tiny operations, and when it comes to where their focus is, often publicity is not so much it. They don't have a huge publicity machine. The publicist that you choose should be a trusted voice, somebody who is a great writer, who publishes with different magazines and different publications, so that when reviewers or music media get an album from them and get like a little press release from them, they know that that's worth listening to and worth writing on and worth reviewing. So you want to get sort of like a trusted person. My publicist has been Nick Storing, who is a great composer, a great writer. When he takes on a project, he really believes in it. And when people receive something from him, they're like, like, if this has Nick's stamp of approval, then I think that I should probably take a listen to it, because they literally cannot listen to everything that comes across their desk. They kind of have to function as gatekeepers a little bit, which is unfortunate, but there's just not enough time in a life to listen to all the music that's released. Good and effective publicity leads to reviews, which are super important. Sometimes even when they're bad, they can be very fun. And I think a neutral or a bad review is kind of a little bit of a badge of honor as well. Interviews, sales, very helpful. Obviously, streams and listens, additional performances, and commissions. I think once I released Impurity Chains, I don't know what the exact number is, but I saw a huge increase in the amount of commissions that I got, and specifically from people outside of Toronto, because everything I was doing was very geographically cloistered to where I lived. Makes sense. But then once I had released the album, I felt like my career kind of got more national in nature. I got more communications and interest from folks in Montreal or in Vancouver, and just kind of widened that berth a little bit, which I know is very important for a lot of us. All right, you've got that budget, you've thought really carefully about it. Now what? It's the assemblage time. So depending on what's actually on your album, maybe you're a performer composer and you've got it covered and set yourself. That's very lucky. I commend you. Unless that's the case, you'll need to hire or assemble an ensemble. You're gonna need to make sure that you have immaculate scores and parts. You're not wasting any of your rehearsal time on errors in that domain, or instructions or working method if you're working with text scores or instructions or improv, etc. So pre-formed ensembles will likely require less rehearsal. They know each other well, they know each other's musical tendencies, they've got that pre-existing musical chemistry that's very important. So you can hire, the local string quartet or the local chamber orchestra who play together all the time. Or you could assemble an ad hoc ensemble, choose each person individually. They may require more rehearsal. They will likely require more rehearsal, but that approach kind of allows you to handpick every individual ensemble member. For me, sometimes I have weird instrumentation, so there's not preformed ensembles anyway, but I also have really specific people that I like to work with that are not already playing in preformed ensembles. So I do really like the ad hoc approach. You have to ask yourself if you'll have the time and the organizational skills to administrate and organize the rehearsals of this music. It's like you're taking on this whole new music director job when you do this sort of thing. If you don't have the time and the skills to that, hiring an administrator to handle this will make your life so much easier. It is an eligible fee in a grant budget. Like, put it in there if you think you need it. They can schedule the musicians, they can do the contract part, they can pay everybody and just handle all the communications, because the amount of emailing is frankly wild. So in terms of assembling everybody, you're going to need to rehearse. You can't just go straight into the studio and use precious studio time and precious studio budget on rehearsal. So you're going to need a separate rehearsal period and space, ideally really, really close to when the actual recording is happening in terms of time, like the same week or the week before. You want like a good size dry space for that rehearsal. And enough time for the performers to really learn and understand the music. So even if it's a somewhat smaller ensemble, like 6 or 7, and you wouldn't normally have a conductor for that in a live concert setting, it can be really helpful to have a conductor just for the purposes of doing the recording. People can't see that there's a conductor, and not that it should matter anyway. So I once got the advice from my conductor that I've hired several times, great conductor, great composer, Brian Current, that the most ideal amount of rehearsal time is 1 hour of rehearsal for every 1 minute music to be recorded. It's quite excessive and you probably won't get it budget wise, but it's what you ask for and then you work with what you get after that. It's kind of like the Cadillac of proportion for time. So with the actual recording sessions after you've done your rehearsal, they are by most union standards a 3-hour call with a break in the middle. So you need to be quite economic and assured in how to approach the recording, because 3 hours with a break, it's really like 2.5 hours. So ahead of time, before you get into the booth, you need to find appropriate sections in each work as kind of clean cuts, so large chunks where you can really easily splice together the best takes that you've done. It is possible to get recordings of stuff in single takes. It does happen, but I have found with all of my recording sessions, especially as people get warmed up, a lot of classical musicians are not used to the recording studio environment. It's really like sort of a Frankenstein stitch job. Although with a good editor and stuff, you would never know it, of course. So it's kind of easy for music in short movements to do this. More challenging if there's tons of residual sounds, ringing percussion and piano that you can't really like cut out or start in the middle of. It's really challenging in the moment to decide where your sections are, where your cuts are. So if you can have all of that decided before you step foot in the recording studio, you will absolutely thank yourself later. So after everything's been recorded, the next step is editing those takes together. So even if you're not the producer yourself, you will probably have a say and want to have a say in which were the best takes from the recording session. So ideally you or the producer will have written down the best takes for each session during the session. Of course, you will listen back to it without kind of the elevated adrenaline going on from the recording session, to be like, oh, actually, I heard that as the best session, the best take in the moment, but it's not actually the best take. But I have found that what you mark in the session as like, this is the one we're keeping, is overwhelmingly the one that you do end up keeping. You kind of know it in the moment. And then you give that feedback or confirmation to your engineer once they have sort of stitched it all together as like the sort of raw take before there's been any massaging of sounds. But you're like, okay, these are the right takes stitched together, sort of pre-edits. When you get those, you need to have a way of listening to the audio that you've recorded in high fidelity. So through good speakers or headphones, because you might have feedback like, yeah, the violins are a little too bright or too strident sounding, or that attack is just a little bit flammy. They're not quite together. You need to be able to listen back really, really carefully and be specific as possible with the editor, so that you can be happy with the final product. A lot of the times, our editors and our recording engineers are not in experimental music. They're not in classical music. So some things that they may have just been able to kind of edit on their own intuitively with other genres of music, they might not be so fast with it with this specific genre. So being able to be really specific and clear with them is helpful. Also give everything to them in timestamps, their feedback, not with measure numbers or bar numbers, because they're not usually reading music with it either. So now you've got an album's worth of recorded audio. What happens then? So the thing about albums is they exist in many formats. A lot of us are used to, at this point, we've transitioned to digital only or streaming. And you might be tempted to avoid the additional fees of a physical release, but it is extremely difficult to get any press attention or reviews for a digital only release. This again ties into like the torrential flood of music and quote unquote content that gets uploaded online every single day. So most reviewers are still reviewing from receiving a physical release, and many college and community radio stations, which almost always have like an experimental music show, like all these little American college campuses usually will have at least one cool weirdo playing like all of the contemporary classical hits. They play from CDs a lot of the time. So like that's kind of a lot of the CDs that you end up producing get mailed off to folks like those, rather than stores. So if you release on CD or vinyl, you also need to consider the various packaging and art. Do you use a jewel case, cardboard folds? Do you do a printed insert for vinyl? Do you have disc art? All things that you kind of need to consider. And I find a lot with these more sort of visual arts considerations, a lot of us have not thought about these types of questions before. And so it's helpful to know ahead of time before, kind of like you've got this album and then you're like, well, what does it look like? What's the packaging? Like, best to have something in mind beforehand. Now that you can listen to it in order, though, you probably have a better sense of its sonic identity and can convey that a little better to your album artist and graphic designer. Now, for a lot of us, we probably already have live recordings of our music to share with an artist before they've been recorded. So if you want to kind of share the music with someone and say, okay, like the vibe needs to match, the aesthetic of the cover needs to match what we're listening to, you don't have to wait until you've recorded everything. Because like I said, you probably already have at least a rough recording of it. And most folks, like at a record store, for example, they will see your album art before they hear anything. And same with Bandcamp, actually, before they hear a single track, they'll see the album art. So it should be something that's evocative and reflective of the music contained within it. It doesn't mean that the art needs to be super loud or anything. It just needs to be distinct in its identity and sort of belong with your music. So you want to hire an artist that can really kind of reflect that vision. And you need to be able to provide, much like to the engineer, you need to be able to provide them with really tangible feedback and commentary if they don't produce something that matches what you're looking for right away, which can be really challenging if we don't have like vocabulary for visual art. And I'm sure a lot of us don't, because we're not steeped in it so much, or at least some of us aren't steeped in it so much. I'm like, I like visual art, but I am deeply unskilled and untalented with it. So I have been working with the same artist for all of my albums. Most of my video work is all done with Dan Tapper, who is also a creative sound technologist. And it sort of just broadly into the same type of music that I'm in. And I have very little communication that I have to do with him. He just usually does something that I like. But that's very lucky. You need to be able to be comfortable and competent in explaining what you don't like if you get delivered something that is not appropriate. Because imagine doing all of this work and then hating your album cover. That sounds terrible. Okay, so you got a finished manufactured album. Amazing. You have now got to determine the release date. Again, not something that I would have thought about really before doing this. I've learned for press purposes, it's actually best to release your album on a Friday and not during the summer. So I have now, I think I released one in February and the other two in the fall. I think one in September, one in October. If you're interested in submitting to the Juno Awards, which I highly recommend, you can actually be eligible for 2 consecutive award years if you release in the fall, because the eligibility period is like 14 or 15 months. So if you release in September, you're eligible for that year and the year after, which is why I have been eligible for like multiple years, like more years of Juno's worth than I have albums released. You also want to give enough time between completion and release to submit to press, give people time to listen and to write about the music before it's released. So you should have that album, that physical album, and everything ready to go to press outlets and magazines and stuff at least 2 months before the actual release date. Another thing that I would it's very nice, if very warm and fuzzy feeling as a composer, but it's also a nice way to kind of get people excited about the album, is having a release event. So with Center Discs, when you pay for their package, it comes with a small concert and reception, which is super nice, but there's not, I think the budget, it's been a while, but in 2022, that budget was like $750 for a release party. So it's not a lot of money to pay musicians to come in and play something from the album. So within your budget, it's nice to like put a little performance fee for the reception, so that like when people are celebrating the release, they also get to listen to a little bit of the music live. And I know that we hate being our own cheerleaders, but for this sort of stuff, we really do have to share it excessively. Your publicist will get the album outside of your own communities and your own geographic center, but you really need to like display, and you should really have sincere enthusiasm about your album. And the sharing of that is really crucial. You can use social media, but even better is like sending individual emails to your colleagues, your friends, your supporters to share it with them. I've also had quite a bit of luck in having my stuff carried by local record stores, whether it's in Glasgow or St. John's or Toronto. They're usually quite enthusiastic to carry releases from local artists. And also, we're not really in the habit of doing this as classical and experimental and concert composers and musicians, but we can bring our releases to concerts and put it on a merch table. Like I see almost at every concert that has CDs available or has physical media available, I see them being bought. Like it's usually just like 1 or 2 people, but it's like it's steady. So I think treating our music more like popular music in general is kind of fun, or DIY, and having a merch table and having your CDs is a good shout. It doesn't need to be like the music from the concert, doesn't need to be the music on the CD. It's more like if you like what you heard tonight, then maybe you would also like this collection of works. So that's it for my presentation. I have a budget table and stuff I could share too potentially, but I think for now, maybe we can move on to some questions.
Yes. Now, I'm not sure if the chat is actually working correctly, so I apologize if you've been trying to put things in the chat and not getting them through. So I think I see a couple of hands going up, which implies maybe that the chat is not working correctly. Sorry, we don't normally have this many people attend these sessions. Let's just go with, yeah. So throw your hands up in the listing thing, and then pop your mic and camera on, and let's go. So I saw Fiola. I think I saw you had a question. Why don't we start?
It may have just been applause as well.
Or maybe it was applause. I don't know. They can tell me.
Hello.
Yes.
I was just clapping.
Okay. Sorry. Karen,
I am a curious about the rehearsal. Like, has that so for a 15-minute album, that'd be like 50 hours of rehearsal. That seems wildly generous. Is that
It's like excessive, like
okay?
grandfathered in era of rehearsal. Yeah, I don't think that it's viable or normal for the past two eras of rehearsing and recording probably, but it's likely like an older sentiment where if people are learning the music from scratch, that's how much they would want for it. But I don't think it's an actual realistic number. It's more like you put that in there and then you get less than that.
I see. Do you recommend, because there were a lot of factors that I hadn't considered, like line items in the budget, basically, like administrative fees, producer fee for like the composer themselves. Like, I guess my worry would be like adding all of this up. Is there like does your application become less like viable if you're kind of like is it in my benefit to be more conservative and be like, well, I could cut corners here by like not hiring an administrator, or I could not pay myself to be the producer. Like, is that, or is it better to be like, no, this is a serious project, I'm taking it seriously, and this is all the work and money that I really need to make it awesome. Like, do you have a sense of that, like having gone through it a few times now? Does that question
Yeah,
make sense?
my experience is that like my bigger, more ambitious projects have been more likely to get funding than ones that I have been conservative with. Yeah, for sure. And also in terms of viability, having an administrator makes the project more viable because you know it's going to be administrated properly.
Right.
And one of the things that I will do is really consider all of the, what do you call them? In-kind expenses. So my budget looks quite large if you consider like the in-kind. So for example, the Canadian Music Center will often give you rehearsal space, and then that's worth, let's say, a couple $1,000s. And that means that if you're asking for everything that's not in kind from the Canada Council, it's only like 85% of your budget that you're asking for rather than 100, because you have all of these in-kind expenses that you get to consider as part of it. And I do think that if you can at all, try and have multiple funding sources. It also increases the viability. So I got by far the lion's share of my funding for all of my albums from the Canada Council, but I always got at least a little bit, at least a few thousand from like Factor, from Toronto Arts Council. I think Toronto Arts Council was only five or $10,000. But the fact that other people believed in the project first really increased its viability. So kind of having an order to which you apply to can also be really helpful in terms of like you wait for like that really big ask for the last one, and they can see that you have other modes of funding.
Cool. Thank you.
Cheers. Karen?
Yeah, Karen, I was muted. Karen is next, I believe.
There. I'll also put my video up. So I'm just wondering, this might have been covered, and I have been listening, but I'm just wondering, so what if you wanted to start off with like a little EP? I'm not saying little, as in maybe 3 pieces, 3 works of music. It just, like I'm more of like a, what if I don't get my funding? Do you know what I mean? And so I'm just wondering, would they take that seriously, or is it just, let's just kind of do the whole shebang and see what happens?
I think it very much depends on who your assessors are for your jury. The viability, so that the 3 things that they look at the Canada Council are impact, viability, and artistic merit. So the viability for a smaller project, for an EP project with 3 pieces on it, quite viable, quite doable maybe for someone who hasn't put out an album before, but maybe you would get smaller points on the impact because it might not be as big of a release or as big of a pivot for your career necessarily. But the thing is, you can always contextualize why an EP would be super impactful. In fact, when I was an assessor on a Canada Council jury, I almost always awarded very high impact marks to any recording projects, just because I knew from personal experience how much it kind of like flung my career forwards. Like a recording project is super impactful, kind of almost inherently. So there's no reason not to go for the EP, especially if like those pieces belong together, and to put them with something else would kind of dampen their impact a little bit if you think they make a nice snack together that you don't want to serve with anything else, then I think you can absolutely go for an EP.
Okay, thank you. I just yes, you when I'm thinking about putting out a grant for a full album, from what I've just heard from you, yeah, I'm thinking, what about an EP? So anyway, this is
That is
it's
so
just
fair. I can tell you my budget numbers. So for the orchestra album, it was like around $70,000. For the chamber music album, it was around 30 or maybe like $28,000. So the answer to what if I don't get my grant is that you simply cannot do it. There's no other way, right? So you're like very dependent on that funding. And I think EPs are great. I like listening to EPs. I like buying EPs. So they're in no way kind of like the second option. They just like make more sense for the music that you're releasing. I think it works totally well.
okay. And I'm sorry if anybody else has questions. I just want to one more little backup question to this is that so you've made your EP with funding if you get the funding. How likely is it that your next grant proposal would be taken seriously if it was more of a full album? Hope and dream.
Yeah, they might see it as like a really effective stepping stone. Like you've successfully released an EP and it did well, then all right, they're ready for an album. They're ready for a full length album. It could be. It certainly wouldn't be seen as anything less than neutral. Like I think you're looking at neutral to positive in terms of reactions from assessors and stuff. It certainly wouldn't be a negative.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Really
cheers.
appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen. Felipe, I believe you are next.
Yep. Hi.
Hi,
Hey.
Felipe.
How you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
Oh, good. So I had a question regarding your background in the albums that you've made. In some of them, not all of them, there's been like heavy emphasis in electronics and basically like the acoustic route. So if we step back from the creation of the album as the recording medium and the release and all this, but to the conception of it, to basically the creation of it. If say, and I had a discussion about this with grant officers already, but I wanted to see what your experience with this was. When you're making electroacoustic works, the medium itself is the recording. So in a way, when you're in a research and creation grant, it's almost as though you are in a recording grant, which can get a little bit dicey. So I've been told already that if you in fact are in the creation stage, then for sure it's just, let's call it research and creation if it's Canada Council, or a commissioning grant if it's any other council. But I kind of wanted to just ask about your journey from that starting point when you're looking for grant funding in the conception stage and then moving into the actual recording stage.
Yeah, so my electroacoustic music is always mixed music. There's always a live instrument as a part of it. So even though there is like a production and a recording angle with the electronic side of it, it's not just like a studio endeavor. The other thing is when I do creation grants, I also budget for time in the studio to record material for the electronics. And that is distinct and separate. But one trick that I have learned from the composer James O'Callahan is that you can actually, within your research and creation grants, within that conception writing stage, you can budget for an archival recording as long as it's kind of like not due for what's the other grant that's not research and creation?
Concept and realization.
Concept to realization. Yes, exactly. So as long as it's not like for commercial release or non-commercial release in the case of our genres often, like you can put in like a recording fee for the performer and a rental fee for the space for them to just do an archival recording of the piece. And that can be in addition to renting out the studio for them to record material for your stuff electroacoustically. So, I mean, the thing about these Canada Council in particular grants is that they're super flexible. Like the amount of things I've seen on the budget that I wouldn't necessarily would think are allowable, like software purchases, for example, to do your electronics, or the development of a actually for this album I had Dan Tapper, who I mentioned did my album artwork, and he's also done some of the electronic stuff. He created just like a device to change the reverb with the hand for the soprano, so that we like didn't need to do weird stuff in the booth, and that was like covered in the grant.
Okay, super cool. All right, so basically there's a lot of flexibility to move around with whatever it is that you're doing at the composition stage, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. But like for my albums, all of the pieces had been ready to go for quite some time. So like the composition stage and the recording stage were very separated from one another. So I wasn't kind of like thinking of them as their lives in the studio. It's just that all that stuff kind of came after.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, cheers.
Thanks, Felipe. I can't remember who had it first, but I think it was Shea or Shea. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I apologize if I'm not, and please correct me if I'm not.
Yep, you're close enough. That's Shay.
Okay.
Nobody ever gets that
Hi,
right.
Shay.
Yeah, I'll take it. Thank you very much for this presentation. This was super informative and helpful. I just have a question about the various catch-22 situations that seems to come with a lot of this, and with grant writing in general, but whether it's kind of getting performers secured before the funding is secured, or getting one source of funding secured before the other one. Yeah, I'm just not really sure how to approach the timing of all of those sorts of things. I don't know if it's just, yeah, wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, understood very much, because I think for a viability assessment, they really like to see that you thought about who you'd like to work with. And they also really like to see highly enthusiastic letters of confirmation from collaborators. So it is really nice if you can have people lined up ahead of time, but with this huge asterisk caveat to those people that if the funding doesn't come through, we're not doing the project. But if you know what I mean? And so a lot of the time, because the lead time, as you can imagine, is enormous, right? And a lot of times, like, you get the funding and they're like, oh, I'm so glad that you signed on for this like 2 years ago or a year and a half ago or whatever. We're gonna start rehearsals, and then the person's like, I don't live in the country anymore, or like sometimes people are no longer around. But what I've also found is that the arts councils are also flexible. Like, they understand all that stuff. And so if you have a slightly different configuration of musicians involved in your recording grant, there's no penalty for that. Like, ultimately the project is the album. If your collaborators sort of shift over time, it's like super permissible for sure. Even your like the tracks that you include could change. Like, all that stuff is yeah, it's more malleable than it would seem, for sure. But I think having your vision lined up for who you want to work with ahead of time will probably reflect better on you than saying, I am recording an album for these pieces. I would like to work with these ensembles, but then you don't have any like confirmation from those ensembles, for example, or letters. That doesn't look quite as sturdy, I would say.
Right. Okay, that makes a ton of sense. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Good question. Catherine.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi,
Bekah,
Catherine.
thanks so much for such a informative session. This is very helpful and daunting at the same time as I'm trying to get down. I'm like, so I think I might have been writing my question because I go blank-minded when I'm asking things. So while Shay was asking you something, so I might be about to repeat what he asked, but I'm gonna do it. So I'm interested in creating an album of choral works, and I have a specific ensemble that I'd like to work with in mind. And most of the pieces that I'd like on the album are already written, although I'm in the process of determining track listing, order, and overall vision. But my question is, at what point do you recommend reaching out to the ensemble? And should I find like a label for distribution first? I know you mentioned center discs. So is it kind of one of those things where I like you were just saying to Shay, like get their consent confirmation and then take that to center discs in that instance?
I would do. So I've worked with a lot of ad hoc ensembles. So a lot of times I don't need like a particular ensemble's permission before I have gone to the distributor. But I think with center discs, it would be helpful for them to have an ensemble in pocket already. Okay. And you can just tell the ensemble, I'm planning on going to center discs with this. I'll let you know what they say. but would you be interested? So no matter where you go, there's at least one person who you have to be like, nothing is confirmed yet. You're the first point along this line.
Yeah.
Will you sign on without having anything else kind of in place yet? And if it's an ensemble or distributor or whoever you have a pre-existing relationship with, that's okay most of the time, right? And
Okay.
they'll believe in the vision, especially if you've got like your proof of concept already ready to go. You've got these recordings of these choral pieces, they already exist.
Yeah.
I think going to the ensemble first is the way to go in this case.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, cheers.
Another good question. I want to get to Anna has a question in the chat, and it's
Yes.
I think I know what this is getting at because I think I've heard it from people before. How have you handled all the factor questions about statistics related to your releases and career? What do you talk about? I guess this is
I'm gonna
because
s-
we kind of do non-commercial music. So
Yeah, you know what? I actually found the factor application to not be so intense, but like before I did it, everybody was just like, ah, that factor budget, eh? And now I'm just trying to find the application so I can see what I said. I think one of the things that I did with factor that I didn't really do with anywhere else was talk about like, because it just I know it feels weird for lots of us, was talk about like media coverage, like talk about like the CBC Hot 30 under 30, or like this article in the Whole Note, or this stuff that had less to do with concrete numbers. Because when you get to like streaming numbers, like it's just so sad for composers to talk about streaming numbers. Like it's not good. And if you're comparing it to commercial music, it's almost like a useless metric, really. But what you could talk about is you had something premiered at the Orpheum and there was 1,000 people there, which is a lot for a classical music concert. Or you could just give them context about what is good for a classical piece. So for example, I've had a couple of pieces on Score Follower, and those usually have at least like 3,000 views. And as sad as this is, 3,000 views is actually great for a piece of classical music. And so just reminding them that it is a different context, and that within the context, within the field you're working in, these are all meaningful metrics or meaningful numbers. You're just doing a little convincing. You're just doing like a little massaging about what is like sincerely true. And I was successful in my factor grants both times. And they're these, for factor, a $10,000 grant is very small. So I don't think, and usually you're capped at 10,000 and you're considered like a non-commercial artist, or like they have like tiers of artists. And I think basically all classical artists are like that bottom tier of artists where you cap at that 10,000. But because of that, the expectations are not that you're a Grimes level Canadian musician. Like they're happy to give you kind of that 10,000, which goes a long way for a lot of classical albums. So yeah, I talk about the successes in the context of the field we are working in rather than in the context of Canadian commercial music, and it has worked. So
it sounds like maybe something the CLC should bug Factor about one of these days. Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands. I'm just going to take a quick gander at the sign up form to see if we missed any questions. There was one here about who's responsible for distributing royalties and sales to musicians and all that stuff. That I believe, yeah, that would be SOCAN or the AFM, but that's kind of that's pretty out of your hands, I think.
If your contract just has you hiring the musicians for what they record in the studio and not have any royalties, which I think is actually quite normal for a lot of
Pretty
contemporary
standard.
classical. Yeah, it's quite standard. I've seen a number of contracts now. I don't think anybody pays out, not anybody, but most people are not paying out royalties to the performers, because we get extremely limited. Like I'm getting, I think maybe I got like $150 in royalties from a radio play last year from Bestiaries, which I thought was played a lot, but evidently it was not caught in those swoops that SOCAN does. Imagine divvying that up between like the 35 people who performed on it. I feel like them getting their $1.80 SOCAN check would be like equally insulting to them, you know what I mean? So it hasn't been a big priority to look at the royalty distribution. But generally speaking, I think it's within the norm that the royalties go 100% to the composer for these composer-produced, composer-led albums.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. And I think all these other questions I'm seeing here about marketing, timeline, production, et cetera, these have all pretty much been covered. So unless
Amazing.
anyone has any final questions, I think we can kind of start to wrap up. I'd like to thank Bekah for.
Sorry, I do have
Oh,
one more
we
question.
oh, sorry.
I didn't put
Sorry.
up my hand. I just thought about it just 2 seconds ago.
Okay.
So this was brought on by the last person who asked a question about a choir. So what if you have a couple different ensembles that you already work with and you want to record an album, but they're separate ensembles? Is that like completely normal? Or do
Yeah.
you have to have one big ensemble that you always work with?
No, I think it's super normal to have different ensembles. It's easier administratively to have one ensemble, but that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. So my first disc in Purity Chains, like there are 6 tracks and it's 6 completely different ensembles.
Okay.
Yeah, it just means like, so you've got like a 3-hour call time, and so they kind of just load in at different times into the studio. You have your separate rehearsals. There's just a lot more administration involved, but that's not a reason not to do it. It's just a little bit more work.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, cheers.
Nice. So yeah, I mean, that is the reason for, as you could see, this was a very dense, info heavy presentation, and so hence the
Yes.
recording. But I just would like to thank Bekah for her knowledge, expertise, the time it took to put this presentation together, and for presenting it in such an engaging fashion. And I hope that we'll see how the funding, I guess, works out, but hopefully everyone is inspired to go and start thinking of an album concept and putting in grant applications. And of course, if you do have questions about grant applications and the process, I would direct you to something we put on our website recently, which we're calling our Successful Grants Database. These are redacted grants that have been successful. Some of them are concept and realization. Some of them are provincial. We're trying, and this is a living thing. So if you do have any successful grants you actually like to share with us, that'd be great. We'll make sure there's no personal info.
I think at least one of my recording grants is in there.
Amazing. So
yeah.
If you want ideas for how those should look, then head right over there. You can always get in touch with me. There's the program officer, like Felipe mentioned, at the Canada Council, can be quite helpful. So yeah, I hope everyone is inspired to make a record, and I want to thank everyone for showing up. And I will send the YouTube link once we get this thing bounced and uploaded, which will probably be next week, and I'll make sure everyone has access to that.
Yeah, I'll send the PowerPoint too, August, if you want to email folks the PowerPoint. And I
Yeah,
look
we could do
forward
that.
to hearing your albums, everybody. We should all be releasing music. It'll be fun.
Amazing. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.